The stagecoach hit a rut in the road so deep that Vivienne Ashcroft's teeth knocked together, and she pressed her fingers flat against the window glass to steady herself. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched in every direction without apology. No gentle hills softening the horizon the way New England had. No familiar church steeples rising above familiar rooftops. Only sage and dust and sky so enormous it felt like a threat. She had been traveling for 19 days. She had counted every one of them. Vivienne was 22 years old, and she had left Boston with a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, her mother's small book of herbal remedies, a change of stockings, and a letter she had not intended to keep but could not bring herself to throw away. That letter lived at the very bottom of the bag, folded into quarters, pressed beneath everything else as though weight alone could make it matter less. It was a letter from a man named Frederick Aldous Pemberton III, who had courted her for 8 months, who had spoken of the future in terms of certainty, and who had written 4 precise sentences to end their understanding 3 weeks after her father's creditors arrived at the door. She had memorized those 4 sentences without meaning to. She did not think about them now. She thought instead about the broker's advertisement, which she had read so many times in the boarding house room she could no longer afford that the paper had softened along the fold lines. Respectable rancher, Elco, Nevada, seeks cultured wife for household management and companionship. Good character guaranteed. Good character guaranteed. She had signed the agreement because the alternative was the street. The stagecoach slowed, and Vivienne straightened her spine before it stopped completely. That was the thing about losing everything, she had discovered. You found the small dignities, and you held them. You sat up straight. You kept your hands folded. You did not let people see the trembling until you were alone, with a door between you and the world. The driver's face appeared at the window, weathered as old leather, his expression carrying the particular sympathy of a man who had delivered mail-order brides to frontier towns before, and understood what he was delivering them to. "Miss Ashcroft, this here's Elco." Vivienne nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. "Your intended should be waiting at the general store, corner of the main street." She nodded again, gathered her carpet bag against her chest, and allowed the driver to help her down into the Nevada afternoon. The heat was different here. Boston heat was wet and heavy, something you moved through. Nevada heat was clean and merciless, a thing that came at you from the sky and the ground both at once, bouncing off pale dirt until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Vivienne stood in it for a moment, blinking, while the stagecoach dust settled around her boots. Elco was not much to look at. She had known it would not be much to look at. She had told herself this many times during the journey, rehearsing the lowering of expectations the way she had once rehearsed piano pieces, carefully and repeatedly until the performance came out right. But knowing a thing and standing in front of it were different matters entirely. The main street was unpaved. Of course it was unpaved. The buildings on either side were mostly raw lumber, some of them still pale with newness, others weathered to the gray of old bone. A saloon sat at one end with its doors open despite the hour, laughter spilling out like something that had no business being cheerful. 2 men stood outside the hardware store engaged in a conversation that involved a great deal of gesturing. A woman in a faded calico dress hurried past with her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her feet, and Vivienne watched her go and understood something wordless about what it meant to be a woman in a place like this. She walked toward the general store. She was aware of being watched, not unkindly most of it, Simply the frank curiosity of a small town that knew everyone it contained and recognized at a glance when someone new arrived. She kept her chin level and her gaze forward. She kept walking. The general store smelled of coffee and sawdust and something sweet she could not identify. A man behind the counter looked up when she entered, assessed her in a single practiced glance, and offered her a small nod of recognition. "Miss Ashcroft, I expect," Garrett Hollowell's intended. "Yes." He stepped out to check on something at the livery. Said he'd be back directly. The storekeeper paused. "You want to sit? Chair right there by the window." Vivienne sat. She set her carpet bag at her feet and folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the street. This was the moment she had been traveling toward for 19 days, and now that it had arrived, she found that she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected fear, and the fear was there, certainly, but it was overlaid with something else, a strange flatness, as though her emotions had simply run out of room to perform. She thought about the broker's photograph. It had shown a man standing beside a fence post, squinting slightly into the sun. He had looked serious and competent, the kind of man who knew what needed doing and did it without discussion. He had looked, she had decided, safe, which was perhaps a low bar for a future husband. But safety was not a low thing when you had recently lost it entirely. She heard footsteps on the wooden porch. The door opened. The man who entered was tall, with the kind of lean build that came not from any intention but simply from years of physical work, muscle, and bone without excess. His hair was dark brown and slightly longer than fashionable, curling a little at his collar. His skin was browned from the sun in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors. He was wearing work clothes, a cotton shirt the color of the evening sky, and trousers with dust on the knees, and he carried his hat loosely at his side with the air of a man who has been too busy to think about what he is holding. His face was not the face from the photograph. Or rather, it was, but changed in the way that faces change when grief has moved through them and taken something on its way out. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The set of his mouth was more careful. He looked like a man who had learned to take up less space than he might otherwise occupy, as though he had made some internal agreement about how much of himself to show the world. His eyes were hazel, and they found her immediately, and what she saw in them was not the cold assessment she had braced herself for. What she saw was something closer to concern. "Miss Ashcroft." His voice was quiet, almost tentative, as though he understood that the moment required care. "I'm Garrett Hollowell." Vivienne stood. She had rehearsed this moment too. A gracious smile, a steady handshake, a composed and reasonable first impression. What came out instead was a single syllable. "Yes." He studied her for a moment. Not unkindly. More the way a man studies weather, trying to read what it means. "You've had a long journey," he said. 19 days. Something moved in his expression. "I've arranged a room at Mrs. Drummond's boarding house, if you'd like to rest before anything else, before we talk, before you see the ranch, before any of it." Vivienne blinked. "We're not going to the ranch?" "Not today, unless you want to." He shifted his weight slightly toward the threshold, as though he had not quite decided whether he was staying or going. "I thought you might want some time to settle yourself first. Get a meal. Sleep in a proper bed." She looked at him. She was looking for the catch, the turn in the sentence where the generosity revealed itself to be something else. She did not find one. His face remained open and straightforward, the expression of a man who was saying exactly what he meant and nothing more. "I don't have money for a boarding house," she said. The admission cost her something, the way all admissions of limitation cost something, a small, quiet diminishment. "I've already paid for a week," Garrett said. "And Miss Ashcroft." He paused. "If after that week you decide this arrangement is not what you want, I'll pay your passage back to Boston. No questions asked." The general store was very quiet. Vivienne was aware of the storekeeper at the far end of the counter, making a great show of cataloging something on a shelf. She was aware of the sound of the street outside, horses and voices, and the distant rhythm of Elco going about its afternoon. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had shifted into a slightly different register, not slower exactly, but changed in quality. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Garrett's jaw moved, a small adjustment, as though he were choosing the words with deliberate care. "Because I'm looking for a wife," he said. "Not a prisoner. I know how these arrangements work. I know what the options usually look like for a woman in your position." He held her gaze. "But this only works if you're here because you choose to be. Not because you're afraid and have nowhere else to go." "I am afraid," Vivienne said. She had not planned to say it. It came out with the particular momentum of a truth that has been contained too long. "I know," Garrett said. "If I were in your position, I would be too." The storekeeper cleared his throat. "If it helps any, Miss Ashcroft, Garrett Hollowell is about the most decent man in this county. Treats his hands fair, keeps his word, doesn't drink to excess, and has never in 5 years of my acquaintance done a single thing I'd be ashamed to witness." He went back to his cataloging. "Just thought that was worth saying." Vivienne looked between the two men. She thought about 19 days of travel and the broker's advertisement and the letter at the bottom of her bag from Frederick Aldous Pemberton III, who had not offered her choices. She thought about what it felt like to have someone speak to her as though her fear was a reasonable thing, as though her preferences were a fact worth accommodating. "All right," she said. "I'll stay at the boarding house." The expression that crossed Garrett's face was brief and unguarded, something between relief and something warmer than relief, before his features settled back into their careful arrangement. "Good. Let me carry your bag." Vivienne hesitated only a moment before she allowed it. He took the carpet bag from her grip and handled it with a kind of unconscious care, as though the weight of it was not an inconvenience, but simply a thing he was glad to manage, and he held the door open for her to go first. Outside, the Nevada afternoon had softened slightly, the brutal peak of the heat beginning its slow concession to evening. Garrett walked beside her, but not too close, adjusting his longer stride to match her pace without appearing to notice that he was doing it. He pointed out the doctor's office, the church at the end of the street, the schoolhouse just visible around the corner. He spoke about Elco in the tone of a man who had made his peace with a place and could see its merits without needing to oversell them. Vivienne listened without saying much. She was still taking inventory of the town, the rough lumber and the dust and the openness of everything. The sky above Elco so vast and uninterrupted that it seemed almost aggressive. In Boston, the sky appeared in pieces between buildings and trees and the crowded evidence of accumulated human life. Here, it simply was, enormous and indifferent, reaching from one side of the world to the other without a single thing to interrupt it. It should have made her feel small. Strangely, it did not. She had expected the vastness to diminish her, the way a letter written in large handwriting can make the words themselves seem less important by virtue of the space they occupy. But standing on the unpaved main street of Elco, with the desert stretching away in every direction and the sky pressing down with its full, indifferent weight, she felt instead something she had not expected, a peculiar kind of freedom. In Boston, the city had known her as something specific, the daughter of a failed importer, the girl whose father's creditors had come. The young woman Frederick Pemberton had seen fit to discard when she ceased to represent an advantage. Here, nobody knew her as anything at all. Here, she was only a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpet bag, and whatever she became in Elco would be entirely of her own making. Mrs. Drummond's boarding house was a 2-story structure at the north end of the main street, more solid than most of its neighbors, with actual glass in all the windows and a wooden sign that had been painted rather than merely lettered. The woman who answered the door was stout and capable-looking, with flour on her apron and the efficient warmth of someone who had spent many years making strangers feel immediately less like strangers. "Miss Ashcroft," she said, before Garrett could make any introduction. "You look like you could use a hot meal and about 12 hours of sleep. Come in." Garrett set Vivienne's bag inside the door. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," he said. "If that's agreeable to you. We could have breakfast and talk some. There's no rush about any of it." Vivienne looked at him standing in the doorway, his weight still carried with that slight forward inclination of a man who was genuinely uncertain of his welcome, and she thought that he looked like a man who had been rehearsing patience for a very long time and had finally found a use for it. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He put his hat back on and tipped it to her, a small, old-fashioned courtesy, and then he stepped back out into the Nevada afternoon and was gone. Mrs. Drummond guided Vivienne up the narrow stairs without ceremony, talking as she went about supper times and the location of the washroom and the particular complaints of the second stair from the top, which groaned unless you stepped to the left side of it. The room she showed Vivienne into was small and plain and scrupulously clean, with a single window overlooking the back lot and a quilt on the bed that someone had made with genuine skill, all tiny repeating triangles in blue and cream. "Mr. Hollowell is a good man," Mrs. Drummond said, setting the key on the bedside table. She said it plainly, without the particular tone people sometimes used to convince you of something they were not entirely sure of themselves. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. "Lost his wife and the baby 3 years back. Broke something in him for a while. But he kept on." She smoothed an already smooth corner of the quilt. "There's strength in a man who keeps on." She left without waiting for a response. Vivienne stood in the center of the small, clean room for a long moment after the door clicked shut. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and she set her hands flat on her thighs, and she let herself be still for the first time in 19 days. The sounds coming through the window were all wrong. Wrong quality, wrong rhythm, the particular unfamiliarity of a place that had no context in her memory yet. But there was something in the wrongness that was not entirely terrible. It was simply new. And new was not the same as ruined, even if her body did not yet know how to tell the difference. She reached for her carpet bag. She unpacked methodically, hanging her 2 dresses on the hooks behind the door, setting her mother's herbal book on the small table by the window where the evening light could reach it. Then her hands found what her hands always eventually found when she was afraid, and she pulled out the letter from the bottom of the bag. 4 sentences. She did not read them. She did not need to read them. She simply held the folded paper and looked at the window and thought about the man who had just carried her bag as though it were not a burden, who had looked at her fear and called it reasonable, who had told her she could leave if she wanted and appeared to mean it without reservation. Then she set the letter on the table beside her mother's book. Then she picked up the key Mrs. Drummond had left. It was a plain brass key, worn smooth from use, nothing remarkable about it. But Garrett Hollowell had looked her in the eye when he placed it in her hand and said that he did not have a copy. In a world that had spent the last year reminding Vivienne Ashcroft that she had no room, no claim, no recourse, a man she had known for less than an hour had handed her a key and told her the lock was hers. She sat with that for a long time in the small, clean room as the Nevada evening came on outside the window, painting the sky in colors she had never seen in Boston, orange and rose, and something almost purple at the edges, extravagant and unearned and quietly insisting on its own beauty anyway. She did not know yet what kind of man Garrett Hollowell truly was. She did not know yet whether this place could ever feel like anything other than exile. She did not know yet whether the thing she had agreed to in a desperate moment in a Boston boarding house would prove to be the worst decision of her life or something else entirely. But she held the key in her hand, and outside the window the Nevada sky burned with the particular recklessness of a place that had never learned to be modest about its sunsets. And Vivienne Ashcroft, who had not cried once in 19 days of travel, felt something behind her eyes that she did not allow to fall. Not yet. There was tomorrow morning still to get through first, and the morning after that. And every morning after that, stretching forward into a future she could not yet see the shape of, in a town that smelled of dust and sage and something wild she had no name for, waiting for a man who had promised to earn what she could not yet bring herself to give. She set the letter and the key side by side on the bedside table, two small objects in the gathering dark, one folded and finished, one small and full of possibility, and she lay down on the quilt someone had made with great care and closed her eyes. The key was still there when she woke. She had half expected it not to be. Garrett arrived at Mrs. Drummond's boarding house at precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, and Vivienne knew it was precisely 8 o'clock because she had been awake since 5, listening to Elco find its feet in the dark. The sound of horses being led from stables and men calling to one another across the early quiet. The whole machinery of a working town starting itself up again after the brief pause of night. She had dressed carefully, not in her better dress, which she was saving for reasons she had not yet articulated even to herself, but in the plainer of the two, a dark green cotton that had survived her father's financial collapse because it was practical and well made, and the sort of garment that creditors did not bother to take. She had arranged her hair with the particular precision of someone who understood that appearance was one of the few things still entirely within her control. She had sat by the window and watched the street below and waited, and when she saw Garrett cross toward the boarding house with his hat already in his hand, she had allowed herself exactly 5 seconds to feel the fear, before she stood up and went downstairs to meet it. He looked different in the morning light. The same lean frame, the same careful face, but something in his posture was slightly less guarded than the afternoon before. The way people sometimes ease when they have slept on an anxiety and found it smaller than they left it. He had cleaned up, his hair still slightly damp at the temples, a white shirt in place of yesterday's blue one. "Good morning, Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Good morning," Vivienne said. They walked to the hotel dining room, which was the closest thing Elco had to a restaurant, and sat across from each other at a table by the window and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman who brought the coffee first and the eggs when she got around to it. Garrett wrapped both hands around his cup, and Vivienne wrapped both hands around hers, and for a moment they simply sat in the slightly uncomfortable honesty of two people who had agreed to something enormous and were now in the position of having to begin. "I think we should be straightforward with each other," Garrett said. "I'll start, if that's all right." Vivienne nodded. He told her about the ranch. 5,000 acres of open range, good water from a creek that ran year-round, a solid house that needed a woman's attention, and 3 ranch hands who were excellent cowboys and wholly useless in a kitchen. He told her about his cattle, 800 head of Herefords he hoped to expand over the coming years as the market improved. He told her the practical reasons he had contacted the marriage broker, the housekeeping, the cooking, the management of a household that had been running on neglect and tinned beans for 3 years. Then he paused. He looked at his coffee cup. "I've been lonely," he said. He said it quietly, the way a man admits something that costs him, not looking for sympathy, simply placing the fact on the table between them because he had decided that honesty was worth more than dignity in this particular conversation. "After Margaret died, I thought the work would be enough. For a while it was. But a house feels empty when there's nobody in it except you and the sound of the wind." Vivienne looked at him. She thought about the boarding house room in Boston where she had read his broker listing for the first time, the desperation that had made the words look like possibility rather than risk. "I'll be honest as well," she said. "I came here because I had no other choice. My father died 8 months ago and left nothing but debts. My mother passed when I was 12. I had no family to appeal to, no savings, and no prospects for work that would keep me fed and housed without eventually requiring something I was not willing to give." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this too. "The broker presented this as my best option. I signed the agreement because the alternative was worse." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "That's honest," he said. "You said you wanted honesty." "I did." Something moved in his expression, not pity, she was relieved to see, but something more like recognition. "What I can teach you about the ranch. What I can't teach you is whether you can find something worth staying for." The eggs arrived. They ate in silence for a while, and Vivienne found that the silence was not entirely unpleasant, which surprised her. After breakfast, Garrett showed her Elco. He did it methodically and without pretension, introducing her to people the way you introduce someone to tools you are confident in, with a kind of quiet pride in their reliability. Dr. Amos Beckett turned out to be a gruff man in his late 50s with ink-stained fingers and the particular economy of movement that belonged to someone who had been solving urgent problems for decades. He shook Vivienne's hand and told her the clinic was open 6 days a week and that she should come to him with anything, no matter how small it seemed. Reverend Thomas and his wife were gentle and welcoming, the wife pressing Vivienne's hand between both of hers and inviting her to Sunday services with the warmth of someone who genuinely meant it rather than someone performing the gesture. Vivienne filed this away as notable. And then there was Mrs. Cornelia Whitfield. Vivienne saw her before the introduction, which was perhaps an advantage. Mrs. Whitfield was standing outside the dress shop in conversation with another woman, and she was the kind of person who arranged herself in space as though she were aware of being observed. Her posture immaculate, her dark dress expensive by Elco's standards, her silver hair dressed with the care of someone who still considered appearance a form of power. She was perhaps 60, handsome rather than beautiful, and when Garrett steered their path in her direction, Vivienne felt the quality of his attention shift by some small but perceptible degree, the slight tension in his jaw of a man who is being careful. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'd like you to meet Vivienne Ashcroft, my intended." "Miss Ashcroft." Mrs. Whitfield turned the full attention of her pale eyes on Vivienne and smiled with her mouth. "What a journey you must have had. All the way from Boston." "Yes," Vivienne said. "And how do you find Elco?" "Larger than I expected," Vivienne said, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of polite deflection that carried no real information in any direction. Something in Mrs. Whitfield's eyes registered this and filed it away. "Well," she said, "we must hope you find it suits you. Garrett, you must bring her to my Thursday gathering. We like to make new arrivals feel welcome." "That's kind of you," Garrett said. Mrs. Whitfield turned back to her companion, and they moved on, and Garrett said nothing about the encounter, and Vivienne said nothing about the encounter, and this turned out to be its own kind of communication. On the fourth day, Garrett asked if she would like to see the ranch. They rode out on horseback in the late morning, Vivienne on a mare named Clover who had the patient, heavy-footed temperament of an animal that had spent years being ridden by people who did not entirely know what they were doing. Garrett rode beside her on a dark bay gelding and pointed out landmarks as they went, the creek line visible in the distance by its band of cottonwoods, the far ridge line where the ranch's eastern boundary ran, the way the land changed character as it rose toward the hills. Vivienne had not been on a horse since she was 14 years old. She did not say this. She sat as straight as she could and kept her hands soft on the reins the way she half remembered, and Clover tolerated her inexpertly, which Vivienne appreciated. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, sitting on solid ground above the creek valley with the wide sky behind it. It was larger than she had expected. Log and stone construction, a wide porch running along the front, a substantial barn and bunkhouse set off to one side. The proportions of it were honest and capable, the proportions of a place built by someone who knew what they were building and built it to last. What it was not was a home. Vivienne understood this the moment she walked through the front door. The structure was sound, the furniture heavy and well made, the kitchen equipped with everything a cook could reasonably need. But the whole interior had the quality of a place that had been abandoned not physically, but emotionally, every surface doing only its minimum function, nothing placed with any thought for comfort or beauty or the particular pleasure of a room that had been considered. And there, on the iron nail beside the kitchen door, was a woman's apron, faded blue, the ties slightly frayed, hanging with the stillness of something that had not been touched in a long time. Vivienne looked at it and then looked away and did not say anything. Garrett saw her look and did not say anything either. The apron hung between them like a fact neither of them was ready to address. "It has good bones," Vivienne said, which was the truest thing she could say about the house, and meant it. Something eased in Garrett's expression. "That's the right way to look at it." She spent an hour moving through the rooms with practical eyes, noting what needed cleaning and what needed organizing and what simply needed someone to decide where things belonged. Garrett showed her the root cellar and the water well and the kitchen garden that had been allowed to go mostly to seed. He introduced her to the 3 ranch hands, who tipped their hats and mumbled and made themselves scarce with the efficient embarrassment of men who had been living in an entirely male world and had forgotten how to exist in the presence of a woman without performing self-consciousness. Before they rode back to Elco, Garrett walked her out to the fence line overlook where the full sweep of the valley was visible, the creek catching light in the distance, the cattle moving slowly across the grass like dark punctuation marks on a wide, pale page. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it's not as frightening as I expected," Vivienne said. And then, because it was true, "I think I'm willing to try." The expression that crossed his face in response to that was something she stored away carefully to examine later. She moved to the ranch the following week. She did not make any announcement of the decision. She simply went to Mrs. Drummond the morning after and said she would be going out to Hollowell Ranch and thanked her for the hospitality. And Mrs. Drummond hugged her with the efficiency of a woman who expressed affection through practicality and sent her off with a jar of preserved plums and the instruction to come back to town whenever she needed company. The first morning at the ranch, Garrett was gone before she woke. He had left the coffee pot warming on the stove and a note on the table written in the precise, slightly formal handwriting she was coming to recognize as his, explaining that he was checking on the cattle in the north pasture and would return by midday. He had also left, she noticed, the kitchen as she had found it the day before, every pan in its place, every surface wiped clean, a small preemptive courtesy that she suspected had cost him some effort. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the kitchen because she understood kitchens, the logic of them, the way a well-organized kitchen became a kind of extension of thought. She found where things were kept and decided where they should be kept instead. More practical arrangements, things within reach of where you needed them. She scrubbed the shelves in the pantry and organized the stores, noting what was low and what was unnecessary. She found 3 tins of something that had lost their labels and set them aside as a problem for another day. She did not touch the apron on the nail. She worked around it the way you work around something that belongs to someone else, giving it the respect of its history, while not quite accepting it as permanent. She was kneeling in the kitchen garden, pulling the most aggressive of the weeds away from what turned out to be a surprising number of still-living plants underneath, when she heard the sound from the corral. A horse, distressed, the particular broken quality of an animal in pain. She stood up and shook the dirt from her hands and went to look. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, whose exact age was difficult to determine beneath his sunburn and general air of having been outdoors since birth, was standing beside a roan mare with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who knows something is wrong and does not know what to do about it. The mare had a gash on her left foreleg, not deep, but ragged, the kind of wound that could fester badly if left without attention. "Where does Mr. Hollowell keep his medical supplies?" Vivienne asked. Pete blinked. "In the barn. But ma'am, we usually just wait for him when something like this—" "Show me the barn," Vivienne said. She found what she needed and supplemented it from her mother's book, which she had brought down from her room without quite planning to. The book was 30 years old, its pages soft with handling, her mother's handwriting in the margins adding notes and corrections, and the particular wisdom of a woman who had spent her life paying attention to what worked and what did not. Vivienne had read it so many times that most of it lived in her hands as much as in her mind. She cleaned the wound and treated it, and wrapped it with the steadiness of someone who had something to do and was doing it. And the mare, who had been trembling with pain and the particular animal panic of not understanding what was wrong, gradually stilled under her hands and stood quietly and let her work. Pete watched the whole proceeding with his hat in his hands and an expression that was slowly reorganizing itself from skepticism into something approaching respect. When Garrett returned at midday, Vivienne was back in the kitchen garden. She heard him come into the corral, heard the low exchange of voices between him and Pete, heard a silence that felt like reassessment. Then his footsteps on the path. He stood at the garden gate and looked at her for a moment. "Pete told me about the mare," he said. "She needed attention." "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mother's book." Vivienne sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on a rag. She believed in being useful. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "She was right," he said, and something in the way he said it told her that he was not making small talk. He was making an assessment, and the assessment had come out somewhere she had not quite expected. That evening, after a supper that Vivienne had cooked from the ranch stores, and that the 3 ranch hands had consumed with the focused appreciation of men who had been eating their employers' cooking for 3 years, she was washing the dishes when she heard a horse approach outside. Garrett came in a few minutes later with a slightly different expression than he had worn all day. Something settled in it, something that had made a decision. "There's a man named Silas Draymond," he said, "who has been after this land since before I bought it. I want you to know that, in case he comes around while I'm out." He paused. "He'll be pleasant about it. He's always pleasant about it." Vivienne dried her hands on the dish towel. "What does he want?" "The ranch. He wants to expand his holdings north, and this land sits directly in the way of that." Garrett leaned against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed. "He'll likely want to meet you, assess you, whether you're the kind of woman who might be persuaded to encourage me to sell." "And am I?" "I don't know yet," Garrett said. There was no offense in it. It was simply honest. "Neither do you." This turned out to be more accurate than either of them could have predicted, because Silas Draymond appeared at the ranch 2 days later, on a morning when Garrett had ridden out to the far pasture and was not expected back until late afternoon. He arrived on a good horse, with good tack, and the general presentation of a man who wanted you to notice that everything he owned was of quality. He was perhaps 55, broad in the chest, with a mustache maintained with the precision of someone who associated grooming with authority. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, from the porch where she had come to meet him when she heard the horse, with the flour still on her hands from the bread she had been making. He smiled at her with every appearance of warmth. "I heard Garrett had found himself a wife. I wanted to welcome you to the valley." "That's kind of you," Vivienne said. He talked for a while about the valley, the community, the particular difficulties of life on a working ranch. He was charming. He was polished. He had the quality of a man who had spent decades learning how to seem like exactly what the person in front of him needed him to seem. Then, just as he was preparing to leave, he turned back with the practiced casualness of an afterthought. "I hope you find it suits you here," he said. "Though I'll be honest, it's a hard life, ranching. Garrett is a stubborn man, which I say with respect. But stubborn men sometimes hold on to things past the point of sense. If you find yourself thinking about a different kind of life, a more comfortable arrangement, I want you to know there are options." He held her gaze. "Boston isn't so far as it seems." Vivienne looked at him. She thought about what Garrett had told her, the pleasantness of it, and how accurately he had predicted the shape of this conversation. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Draymond," she said. He nodded, tipped his hat, and rode away down the valley road. Vivienne went back inside to her bread. She punched the dough down harder than strictly necessary and thought about the way Silas Draymond had said the word comfortable, as though comfort were something she was surely desperate enough to be purchased with. She thought about his certainty that she had not yet decided to be here, that she was still suspended in the kind of provisional existence that could be redirected with the right offer. She looked around the kitchen, the clean shelves she had organized, the herbs she had begun drying in bundles above the window, the bread rising under its cloth, the kitchen garden she had half rescued from neglect, with its unlikely population of surviving plants. She was not sure when she had started making decisions rather than waiting for conditions to improve. She was not sure when the ranch had shifted from the place she had come to into something closer to the place she was from. But she was standing in a kitchen that smelled of bread and dried sage, and she had flour on her hands and a roan mare in the corral with a clean-wrapped leg. And when Silas Draymond had suggested she consider leaving, her first response had not been consideration. It had been something more like refusal. She finished the bread. While it baked, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and let herself think properly for the first time since arriving. Not about the immediate work, not about the next task, but about the whole shape of what had happened to her. 8 months ago, she had been a different person. She had lived in a house with furniture and a garden and a father who was difficult but present. And she had believed, with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never been tested by loss, that the future would contain certain things: a home, belonging, the ordinary continuation of an ordinary life. Then the creditors came and stripped the house to its bones, and Frederick Pemberton wrote his 4 sentences. And the woman she had been before all of that became something she could only access from a distance, like a country she had left and could no longer return to. She had not known, boarding the stagecoach in Boston, that the country she was going to would turn out to suit her better. The bread smelled right. She took it out of the oven, turned it onto the rack, and went back to her garden. That evening, after supper, she and Garrett sat on the porch in the particular quiet of a Nevada evening, the air finally cooling as the sky went through its nightly extravagance of color. She told him about Draymond's visit. Garrett listened without interrupting, his face giving little away. "What did you say to him?" he asked. "I thanked him for stopping by." A pause, then very quietly, "Good." They sat in silence for a while. Vivienne looked out at the shape of the land in the dimming light, the long shadows of the cottonwoods along the creek, the first stars beginning to appear in the east where the sky had gone to deep blue. Garrett sat beside her, not close, but present in the way that a fire is present, something you are aware of without having to look directly at it. "Tell me about Margaret," Vivienne said. She was not sure why she said it, perhaps because it was the thing that was most true about the space between them, the fact that she was sitting where someone else had sat, in a life that had been built for someone else, and she thought that pretending this was not the case would only make the distance between them larger. Garrett was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She was from Carson City. Her father had a dry goods store. She was educated, well-read. She laughed at things I didn't expect to be funny." He paused. "We had 2 years. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. When the time came, there were complications." Another pause, longer. The doctor tried everything. "I'm sorry," Vivienne said. "It was the worst thing that has ever happened to me," Garrett said, with the simplicity of absolute honesty. "For a while after, I didn't much care about anything. I just worked. It was the only thing that made sense." He looked out at the darkening valley. "But time passes, and one day you realize you're still alive and you have to decide what to do about that." Vivienne thought about the boarding house room in Boston, about reading the broker's advertisement in the particular desperation of a woman who had run out of other options. "I understand that," she said. They sat in quiet for another while, the stars multiplying above them. "There's a man," Vivienne said. "In Boston." She stopped. "You don't have to tell me," Garrett said. "No." She thought about the letter at the bottom of the bag that was now at the bottom of her wardrobe. "I think I do. He courted me for 8 months. I believed him when he talked about the future. When my father's situation became clear, he wrote me 4 sentences, and that was the end of it." Garrett said nothing for a moment. "He wasn't worth the paper he wrote them on," he said finally, quietly, without drama. Something in Vivienne's chest, a thing she had been carrying for the better part of a year without quite acknowledging how heavy it was, shifted its weight slightly. She did not say anything else about Frederick Aldous Pemberton III. She did not need to. The following morning, the apron was gone from the nail beside the kitchen door. Vivienne arrived downstairs to find the nail empty, the iron hook bare and small against the wood. She stood looking at it for a moment. She did not know what had made Garrett take it down in the night, and she did not ask. 3 days later, moving a stack of linens on the high shelf of the hallway closet, she found it there, folded carefully into a cedar box with a latch. She closed the box and put it back exactly as she had found it. Some things were not hers to disturb. Not yet. She put the coffee on and started the breakfast and looked out the window at the Nevada morning coming in gold and clean over the eastern hills. She did not yet know how to call this place home, but she was beginning, very carefully, to stop calling it somewhere else. October came to the Nevada Valley the way it comes to high desert country. Not gradually, but all at once. The air changing character overnight from the dry heat of summer into something with an edge to it. A reminder that the land had other seasons and intended to use them. The mornings turned cold enough that Vivienne's breath showed when she crossed the yard to the chicken coop, and the light came in lower and more golden through the kitchen window, laying itself across the scrubbed table in long rectangles that made the room look, briefly, like something out of a painting. She had been at Hollowell Ranch for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she had reorganized the kitchen entirely, coaxed the garden back from the edge of abandonment, started a batch of preserves from the late-season vegetables she had salvaged, learned the names and particular personalities of all 8 horses in the corral, and begun to understand the rhythms of a working ranch the way you understand a piece of music by living inside it, the pre-dawn sounds of the hands starting their day, the particular quality of silence that meant everything was going as it should, the different quality of silence that meant something required attention. She had also started to notice things about Garrett Hollowell that she had not been in any condition to notice when she arrived. He talked to his horses the way some men talk to themselves, low and continuous, not quite words, just a presence he offered them, and the horses moved differently around him than they moved around the ranch hands. He saved the last of the coffee for whoever came in from the cold last, which was always whoever had drawn the shortest work, never himself. He had a particular way of going still when he was thinking, not frozen exactly, just very quiet, his hands resting on whatever he had been working on, his eyes focused on something that was not in the room. She had learned not to interrupt this stillness. It resolved itself in its own time, and whatever came after it was usually worth waiting for. These were small things. But small things, she was learning, were how you came to know someone. The writing lessons had been Vivienne's idea, which still surprised her slightly when she thought about it. She had gone to Garrett after breakfast one morning in the second week of October and said that if she was going to live on a ranch, she ought to know how to handle a horse properly. And something in his expression had brightened in the particular way of a man who has been offered something he had not known how to ask for. They rode out every afternoon that the weather permitted. Garrett was a patient teacher in the specific way that came from genuine patience rather than performance of it. He did not speak more than necessary. He demonstrated and then waited. And when she struggled, he simply demonstrated again from a slightly different angle, approaching the problem from wherever she could see it most clearly. He corrected her grip on the reins with a brief adjustment of her hands, his touch brief and impersonal. But his hands were warm and his palms were rough with callus, and she was more aware of the contact than she found entirely comfortable to acknowledge. One afternoon in the third week of October, they rode out to check the fence line on the eastern boundary, a task that took them across the full breadth of the property and up into the foothills where the land changed character, the sage giving way to scrub oak and juniper, the sky opening up in a way that even by Nevada standards felt excessive. They dismounted at the high point and let the horses drink from a shallow creek, and Garrett showed her where the boundary ran along the ridge and explained the water rights that went with that particular stretch of creek and why they mattered. Vivienne listened and looked at the land laid out below them, 5,000 acres of it, every fold and feature of it beginning to be familiar to her now in the way that a face becomes familiar when you have spent enough time looking at it to see past the surface. "You love this land," she said, not a question. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "First time I saw this view," he said, "I knew this was where I wanted to build something. I'd been working other men's ranches for 6 years, saving everything I could." He looked out at the valley. "When I had enough to buy, this was the only place I considered." "It must have been different then," Vivienne said, "before Margaret." He turned to look at her, and she held the look without flinching, because she had decided somewhere in the past 3 weeks that flinching from the truth only made it larger. "Everything was different then," he said, "and also the same. The land doesn't change because you're happy, or because you're not. It just is." He paused. "I used to think that was cold. Now I think it's a kind of honesty." Vivienne thought about that for a long time afterward. There was something in the idea that appealed to her, the notion that the world did not rearrange itself around your private sorrows, that it simply continued being what it was and left you to find your own footing. She had spent the past year feeling as though the ground itself had shifted under her, as though losing her father and her home and Frederick Pemberton's regard had somehow altered the fundamental nature of things. But the land of Nevada was not interested in her losses. It simply stretched, patient and enormous, and waited for her to decide what she was going to do with it. She found this more comforting than she would have expected. It was Nora Webb who told her about the gossip. Nora was 17, the daughter of the blacksmith, who came out to the ranch 3 mornings a week to help with the heavier washing and the kinds of household tasks that one person managing everything alone could not reasonably sustain. She was a small, direct girl with red hair and the particular fearlessness of someone who had grown up in a working household and had no illusions about the relationship between dignity and effort. Vivienne had liked her immediately. She arrived on a Thursday morning in late October with an expression that was trying to be normal and not quite succeeding. Vivienne looked at her over the bread dough and waited. "There's talk," Nora said finally, with the directness of someone who had decided that getting it over with was kinder than prolonging the approach. "In town, Mrs. Whitfield has been saying things." "What kinds of things?" Nora set down the laundry basket. "That you came from a family with a reputation. That there was something improper about why you had to leave Boston. That Mr. Hollowell doesn't know the full story of who he married." Vivienne's hands continued working the dough. She felt the information arrive in her chest and settle there, a familiar weight, the specific gravity of other people's opinions being deployed as weapons. She had felt this before, in Boston, when the creditors came and the social geography of her world rearranged itself almost overnight, friends becoming strangers, acquaintances becoming sources of judgment, the woman she had been before her father's collapse becoming a kind of fiction. "Is that all?" she asked. Nora looked at her with something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it. "That's most of it. Thank you for telling me." She punched the dough down with considerably more force than the bread required and said nothing else about it. That evening, Garrett came in from the north pasture later than usual and found Vivienne at the stove with supper already made and the kitchen smelling of roasted chicken and something with rosemary that she had found growing wild near the creek. He washed up at the outside basin and came in and sat down, and they ate in the comfortable near silence that had become their evening habit, conversation arriving in its own time without being forced. She was clearing the plates when he spoke. "Jack Holloway came out to the north fence today," he said. Jack Holloway was the sheriff, a weathered and fundamentally decent man who had shaken Vivienne's hand on her first day in Elco with the straightforward respect of someone who had learned to assess people on their merits. "He mentioned there's been some talk in town." Vivienne set the plates in the wash basin and turned to face him. Garrett was looking at her steadily from across the kitchen. His expression was the expression she had come to recognize as his version of careful, not closed, not suspicious, simply very deliberate. "I don't believe what I've heard," he said. The sentence was simple and complete, with nothing attached to it that required her to respond to anything except the statement itself. "I wanted you to know that." Something in Vivienne's chest loosened in a way she had not anticipated. She had been holding herself against this conversation without quite knowing she was doing it, braced for the version of it that she had feared, the questions and the doubts and the particular humiliation of having to defend herself to the person whose good opinion she had most reason to want. She felt, to her complete surprise, her eyes fill. She did not cry in front of people. She had not cried in front of anyone since her father's funeral, where she had stood at the graveside and understood that she was now entirely alone in the world, and had stayed dry-eyed through the whole terrible hour by force of will alone. She had cried afterward in a room by herself, carefully, like something she was rationing. But the tears came now before she could stop them. Not many, just enough to betray her, and she turned back to the wash basin as though she had remembered something there. Vivienne. He had not used her given name before, not once. Always Miss Ashcroft, correct and careful, keeping the distance she had needed kept. The sound of her name in his voice was so unexpected that she turned around before she could decide not to. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said. "Not for anything Mrs. Whitfield has said." "I know," she said. "I know that." She pressed the back of her wrist briefly against her eye. "I'm not accustomed to being believed without having to earn it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm sorry for that," he said. "For whoever made you feel that way." They stood in the kitchen in the lamplight, and the stove ticked quietly as it cooled, and outside the Nevada night pressed itself against the windows, and Vivienne Ashcroft, who had come to this place in terror and had spent 3 weeks learning its shape and its rhythms and the particular quality of the man who owned it, understood something she had not expected to understand for a long time yet. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him, she realized, for at least 2 weeks. The fear had gone so gradually that she had not noticed its departure. What had replaced it was something she did not have a precise word for yet, something quieter and more solid than fear, something that felt less like the absence of a thing and more like the presence of one. She was still thinking about this when she carried the last of the dishes to the rack to dry. Garrett had moved to the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, not leaving and not staying, occupying the space between with the particular consideration of a man who was giving her room to finish her thoughts. "I'll have the ledger figures ready by Friday," she said. He nodded. "Thank you." "You don't need to keep thanking me," Vivienne said. "I'm doing it because it needs doing." "I know," Garrett said. "I thank you anyway." There was a pause. "Good night, Vivienne." "Good night, Garrett." She heard him go to his room, heard the quiet sounds of a man preparing for sleep, and stood in the kitchen for a while after, listening to the ranch house settle around her in the cold October night, and thought that there was something almost unbearably ordinary about the sound of another person going to bed. She had been alone for so long that ordinary had begun to feel like a kind of miracle. The next morning, she brought the ranch's ledger books to Garrett over breakfast. She had been working through them quietly for 2 weeks, and what she had found had taken her another week to be certain enough about to present. The books went back 4 years, 2 of them under the previous manager, a man named Aldrich who had left the ranch the previous spring under circumstances Garrett had described only as unsatisfactory. The inconsistencies she had found were subtle but consistent, the kind of gentle, persistent leakage that adds up to a great deal of money over 2 years if nobody is paying close attention. She laid the books out and showed him the figures, column by column, the discrepancies she had marked with small penciled notations in the margins. Garrett looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up at her, there was something in his face she had not seen there before. Not surprise exactly. She had the impression he was difficult to surprise. Something closer to a recalibration. The expression of a man who has just revised an estimate upward and is taking a moment to adjust to the new figure. "You found all of this," he said. "My father kept books for his import business for 20 years. I helped him from the time I was 14. She kept her voice practical. "The pattern is not difficult to see once you know what to look for." "How much?" "Roughly 15% of the gross income over 2 years. I can calculate a more precise figure if you want, but it will take another day." Garrett sat back in his chair and looked at the ledger books spread across the breakfast table, and Vivienne watched him process it, the financial reality of it and the other reality beneath it, which was that the woman he had come to rely on had just demonstrated that the reliance was not misplaced. "Calculate the precise figure," he said. I'll want it for the lawyer." She nodded and started to gather the books. "Vivienne." She looked up. He was looking at her with a directness that was by now familiar, but still occasionally startled her. "Thank you." "You needed to know," she said simply. "So I told you." Silas Draymond came back 11 days after his first visit. He arrived at noon, which Vivienne suspected was calculated, late enough in the morning that Garrett would likely have ridden out, early enough that she could not reasonably claim she was about to leave for an errand. He was as polished as before, as pleasant, as precisely calibrated to the appearance of a man who had nothing but goodwill in every direction. He did not bother with pretense this time. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Ashcroft," he said, from the chair she had offered him at the kitchen table, because hospitality was not a weapon she was prepared to surrender. "I've made an offer on this land before. Garrett has refused it. But Garrett is a stubborn man, and stubborn men sometimes need the people closest to them to help them see reason." Vivienne poured coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. "I know there's a note on this property," Draymond continued. "Garrett borrowed last year to expand his herd. It comes due in the spring. If the winter is hard, if the cattle prices stay where they are, meeting that note is going to require something close to a miracle." He smiled at her pleasantly. "I'm offering the miracle. I'll buy the land at a fair price. Garrett walks away with money in his pocket, no debt, a fresh start somewhere more manageable. And you," he paused, "you go somewhere more suitable, somewhere with more of what a woman like you is accustomed to." Vivienne looked at him. She thought about what it would have meant to hear this offer the day she arrived, when the fear was still so large it occupied most of the available space in her chest. She thought about whether it would have seemed like rescue then, before she had cleaned the kitchen and treated the mare's wound and found the fraud in the ledger books and sat on the porch in the evening while Garrett told her about the worst day of his life and trusted her with it. "Mr. Draymond," she said, "I wonder if you've noticed that you've now visited this ranch twice, and both times Garrett has been conveniently absent." Something shifted very slightly in Draymond's pleasant expression. "I notice things," Vivienne said. "It's a habit I developed young. My father was a businessman, and he taught me that the structure of a conversation tells you as much as its content." She folded her hands on the table. "You're not making this offer to me because you think I have influence over my husband. You're making it to me because you think I haven't decided yet, that I can be persuaded in a direction Garrett cannot." Draymond was quiet for a moment. "And can you?" he asked. "No," Vivienne said. She said it without heat and without drama, the way you state a conclusion that has been arrived at by careful evidence and is not open for further argument. She said it the way her father had said the word settled when a business negotiation was over. Draymond looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the minimal respect that one capable person extends to another when they have been correctly assessed and outmaneuvered. He left without finishing his coffee. When Garrett came in that evening, Vivienne told him about the visit at supper, and this time she told him all of it, including what she had said. She watched his face as she spoke, and what she saw there was not the relief she might have expected, but something quieter and more considered, the expression of a man who is revising a significant estimate and is not quite finished revising it. "He mentioned the note," Garrett said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had been not quite saying for weeks, The thing that had been present in the careful way he spoke to her and the distance he had maintained, and the small, deliberate courtesies that she had understood, were not for show. "I should have told you about the note before now," he said. "It was not fair to let you come into this without knowing the full picture." "Then tell me now," he told her. The amount, the terms, the spring deadline, the calculation he had been making all autumn about cattle prices and winter conditions and how close the margins ran. He told her with the discomfort of a man who found financial vulnerability harder to show than emotional vulnerability, which she found unexpectedly endearing. When he finished, Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I'll finish calculating the fraud figure from the ledger books this week," she said. "That should give you something solid to take to the lawyer." Garrett looked at her across the table. "Why are you not more frightened?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. "I am frightened," Vivienne said, "but I have found that terror and capability are not opposites. One does not cancel the other out." She paused. "I learned that here, actually." Something moved through Garrett's expression that she did not have a name for yet, though she thought if she stayed long enough she would. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch house settle around her. The familiar creaks and sighs of old timber adjusting to the cold, and thought about what she was doing. Not the practical what, the cooking and the bookkeeping and the garden, but the deeper what, the question of what kind of life she was building here and whether she had the right to call it hers. She had not come here by choice. That was the fixed point she kept returning to. She had come because the alternative was worse. That was not the same as choosing, but every day since she arrived had been a choice. The choice to clean and organize instead of waiting to be told to. The choice to treat the horse's wound. The choice to work through the ledger books. The choice to face Draymond across the kitchen table and say no with a clarity that surprised even herself. At some point, she understood. The sum of those daily choices had become something indistinguishable from having chosen. She was still thinking about this when she heard Garrett moving in the next room, the particular sequence of sounds that meant he could not sleep either. A pause, then the quiet sound of the back door opening and closing. She lay still for another few minutes. Then she got up, put on her shawl, and followed him. He was sitting on the porch steps in the cold dark with his forearms on his knees and his hands loose between them, looking out at the valley where the creek line was visible in the moonlight as a pale thread between darker banks. He looked up when she came out, but did not seem surprised. She sat down beside him, not close, but close enough. The porch step was narrow enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I keep thinking about the spring," Garrett said, "about whether we can make the numbers work." "We'll make them work," Vivienne said. He glanced at her. "You sound certain." "I am certain," she said. And then, because it was the truest thing she could add, "I am also afraid. Both things occupy the same space. I have stopped expecting that to change." Garrett was quiet for a while. The night was very still. The stars over Nevada were excessive in their quantity and brilliance, the kind of sky that made you feel the planet was smaller than you had previously understood. "When Margaret died," Garrett said, "I stopped believing that things could be all right. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly, somewhere in the back of my mind, I stopped expecting it." He paused. "I've been surprised to find that I've started expecting it again." Vivienne did not look at him. She looked at the creek line in the moonlight, The dark shapes of the cottonwoods, the vast open country laid out under the stars. "So have I," she said. Their shoulders were touching. Neither of them moved away. They sat like that for a long time in the cold Nevada night. Two people who had both lost the easy confidence in the future that younger or luckier people took for granted, sitting in the ruins of that confidence and discovering, slowly and without announcement, that something was growing in its place. Vivienne did not know what to call it yet. She thought Garrett probably did not either, but she was not frightened of it. That, she had come to understand, was the most significant change of all. The fire started at 2 a.m. Vivienne woke to the smell before she heard anything. That particular wrongness of smoke, where smoke had no business being, thick and resinous with the specific quality of burning hay and old timber. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully conscious, and what she saw in the yard below erased the last of sleep entirely. The eastern coop and the hay storage attached to it was fully alight, the fire moving through the dry December air with the casual confidence of something that had already won, orange and gold and terrible, throwing light across the frozen yard in lurching shadows. She could hear the horses before she could see them, that particular sound of panicked animals that lands somewhere below the chest and does not leave. She did not stop to think about what to do. She pulled her boots on over her nightgown, grabbed the heavy wool coat from the hook by her door, and was down the stairs and out the back before Garrett had finished shouting for the ranch hands from the bunkhouse door. The next 4 hours were the longest of her life. Garrett and the 3 hands worked the fire itself, forming the bucket line from the creek that ran close enough to the barn to be useful, their figures moving against the light in the particular determined rhythm of men who understand that the line between manageable and catastrophic is maintained by not stopping. Vivienne did not attempt to join that line. She made a different calculation, faster and with less hesitation than she would have expected of herself 3 months earlier, and she went to the horses. The corral gate was already open, Pete having released the animals before joining the bucket line, but 2 of the mares had refused to leave, their fear of the fire and their fear of the open dark arriving at approximately the same intensity and producing paralysis. Vivienne went to them without a lamp, talking in the low, continuous voice she had learned from watching Garrett. Not words exactly, just presence, just the sound of a human being who was not afraid, or who was afraid and was moving anyway, which from the horse's perspective amounted to the same thing. She got the first mare out in 4 minutes. The second took longer, the animal trembling against her hands, the whites of her eyes showing, the fire's heat reaching them even at that distance. Vivienne kept talking, kept her hands steady on the halter, kept her body between the horse and the worst of the light, and eventually the mare came, lurching and blowing through her nostrils, but coming, out through the gate and into the dark field beyond where the others had gathered. She turned back to find Pete standing a few yards away, watching her. "There's 2 men need looking at," he said. His voice was hoarse with smoke. "Burns on their hands. Tom's pretty bad." She went to Tom. His hands were the kind of burn that came from a man who had grabbed something he should not have grabbed because the alternative in that moment was worse. The palms raw and already blistering, the particular damage of contact with heated metal. Vivienne worked by lantern light in the cold air outside the bunkhouse, her mother's book open on the step beside her, not because she needed to read it, but because its presence steadied her, the familiar weight and smell of it an anchor. She knew what to do. She did it. She was wrapping Tom's second hand when she became aware that Garrett had come to stand behind her. She did not turn around. She finished the wrapping, tied it off, told Tom to keep his hands elevated and to come find her if the pain changed character overnight. Then she stood and turned. Garrett was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the careful, measured look that was his default. Not the quiet warmth that had become increasingly visible over the past weeks. This was something stripped of all the usual layers, direct and unguarded. The expression of a man who has just seen something that has rearranged his understanding of what he is looking at. The fire was down to embers behind him, the sky above the yard lit with the last of it. 3 of the hands still moving through the remains with wet burlap to stamp out anything that looked like it might reconsider. The eastern structure was gone. The hay stores were gone, but the barn was intact, and the horses were safe, and the men were alive. Garrett said nothing. He simply looked at her in the dying light of the fire she had helped contain, and Vivienne looked back at him, and the moment lasted long enough that she felt it would leave some kind of mark on the air. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. He nodded once. He went back to the embers. By the time the sky began to show light in the east, the immediate danger was over, and the damage was clear. The hay stores represented a significant loss, the kind that tightened calculations that were already tight. The eastern structure would need to be rebuilt before spring, which meant labor and materials that had not been in the season's accounting. And the fire, Garrett told her in a flat voice over the breakfast she made at 6 a.m. for everyone on the property, had not started by accident. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things, and she saw in the faces of the 3 hands that this was not a surprise to any of them. "Draymond?" she asked. "Can't prove it," Garrett said. Nora Webb arrived from town at mid-morning, having seen the smoke from the valley road. She took one look at the wreckage and at Vivienne's face, and went immediately to the kitchen and put water on to boil. And this efficiency was so exactly what was needed that Vivienne felt something loosen in her throat that had been tight since 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 days later, Silas Draymond arrived. He came in the afternoon, riding alone, his expression configured into the careful sympathy of a man who has brought bad news he happens to find convenient. He sat in the chair Vivienne indicated and folded his hands on the table and said he had heard about the fire with great regret and wanted Garrett to know that if there was anything he could do. Then he produced a document from his coat pocket. He had purchased the note on the Hollowell Ranch, he explained. The bank had sold it to him 2 weeks prior. The terms remained as written, the debt due in full by the 1st of April. However, given the circumstances, given the fire and the losses, he was prepared to be flexible about the terms of that repayment. If Garrett were to consider selling, the purchase price would more than cover the outstanding note, and any remaining amount would be Garrett's to keep. He said all of this pleasantly. He left the document on the table and rode away. Garrett stood at the window and watched him go, and Vivienne watched Garrett, and the quality of the silence in the kitchen was the quality of a silence that has something very large inside it that is not yet ready to come out. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "If the numbers hold and the winter isn't worse than average, we can meet the note by April." He turned from the window. "If anything else goes wrong, we can't." Vivienne looked at the document on the table without touching it. "Then nothing else will go wrong," she said. Garrett looked at her for a moment. "Vivienne, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. That's not why I'm saying it. She went to the desk in the corner of the main room and found the precise figures she had calculated from the ledger books, the full accounting of Aldrich's 2 years of careful theft, and she spread them on the table beside Draymond's document. She had been waiting to feel certain enough. She felt certain enough now. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to see the lawyer. She went alone. She did not tell Garrett she was going until she was already dressed to leave, and when she told him, she watched the objection move through his face and resolve itself into something that was not quite agreement, but was the recognition that she was not asking for permission. I'll come with you, he said. No, she said. Let me do this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let her pass. The lawyer's office was on the second floor above the hardware store, a small room with a great many filing cabinets and a man named Horace Finch, who wore spectacles and had the careful, organized intelligence of someone who had made precision his profession. Vivienne spread her figures on his desk and explained what she had found and what she needed to know. And Horace Finch looked at the numbers and then looked at her over his spectacles and said that she appeared to have done his job already. They spent 2 hours going through the documents. What emerged was this. The note Draymond had purchased contained a clause, standard in such agreements, that specified the debt could not be transferred to a third party without the original debtor's written consent. The bank had transferred it to Draymond without that consent. The transfer was not enforceable. It was a small clause, the kind of clause that a man purchasing a note under pressure of time and secrecy might overlook. The kind of clause that a woman who had spent her childhood learning to read her father's business documents would know to look for. Vivienne rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon with the lawyer's written assessment in her coat pocket and the particular internal stillness of someone who has done everything they can do and is waiting to see if it was enough. She told Garrett that evening. She laid it out plainly, the clause, the illegal transfer, the lawyer's assessment of their position. She set the written document on the table between them and watched him read it. And when he looked up at her, his face had the expression of a man who has been braced for impact and has instead found solid ground under his feet. "You went looking for this," he said. "I went looking for anything useful," she said. "This was what I found." He looked at her steadily. "When?" "The day after Draymond's second visit." Something moved in Garrett's expression at that. The realization that she had been carrying this for weeks, working it quietly in the background of the daily life of the ranch. Not because he had asked her to, but because it needed to be done. And she could do it. "Vivienne," he started. "There's still the matter of the debt itself," she said, because she did not know how to receive what she could see coming in his face, and was not ready for it. "The note is legitimate, even if the transfer isn't. We still need to meet it by April." "I know," he said. "The figures work if the winter doesn't go harder than we've planned for." "I know," he said again. And then, "I know, but that's not what I want to say right now." She looked at him. "I want to say," he said carefully, "that I have never in my life met anyone like you." The kitchen was very quiet. "I mean that," he said. "I mean it in the plainest possible way. You came here not knowing anything about this life or this land or this man you'd agreed to marry, and you have spent every day since you arrived paying attention and doing what needed to be done, and not once have I heard you complain or ask for something easier." He stopped. His voice had roughened slightly. "And last week, you talked a terrified horse out of a burning corral in your nightgown. Despite everything, despite the weight of the evening and the unresolved facts of their situation, Vivienne felt something that was very close to laughter move through her. "It was also a coat," she said. Something happened to Garrett's face then. It was not laughter exactly, but it was the near relative of laughter, the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just discovered that the person beside him has been carrying it too and finds it as absurd and exhausting as he does. The next 10 days were the hardest. Mrs. Cornelia Whitfield chose the second week of January to hold her gathering. Vivienne heard about it from Nora, who arrived on Wednesday morning with the particular expression of someone carrying information they are not sure how to deliver. The gathering was to be held Thursday afternoon at Mrs. Whitfield's house, the usual assembly of the town's women, and the stated purpose was to welcome the new year and discuss the church restoration fund. The unstated purpose, as Nora communicated through her careful expression and her several false starts, was to address the question of Vivienne Ashcroft's character in a more formal setting than doorstep conversation had allowed. Vivienne was not invited. She went anyway. She dressed with the particular care of someone who understands that appearance is a form of argument. Her better dress, her hair arranged with precision, her posture arranged with more precision still. She drove herself in the ranch wagon, which she had learned to handle adequately, if not expertly, and she tied the horse at the post outside Mrs. Whitfield's substantial house, and walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. The woman who answered, one of Mrs. Whitfield's neighbors, went visibly uncertain when she saw who was standing there. "I understand there's a gathering this afternoon," Vivienne said pleasantly. "I thought I should come." She was shown into the parlor. There were 11 women in the room when she entered, arranged in the careful social geography of a community that had known itself for a long time and had established rules about its arrangement. Mrs. Whitfield sat at the center of it, in the chair that was not quite a throne, but served the same purpose, and when Vivienne walked in, the room went through a rapid series of internal adjustments, surprise, reassessment, a settling into watchful attention. Mrs. Whitfield smiled at her with every appearance of graciousness. "Miss Ashcroft, how unexpected." "Mrs. Whitfield," Vivienne said, "I apologize for arriving without an invitation, but I thought it might be more efficient if I were present for whatever conversation you intended to have about me." The room was very still. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes narrowed very slightly. "My dear," she said, "I'm not sure what you imagine." "I imagine," Vivienne said, "that you have some questions about who I am and where I came from and whether I am a suitable wife for a man this community respects." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes that would meet hers. "I'd prefer to answer those questions directly rather than have them answered by rumor," she told them. Not everything, not the things that were hers to keep, but the shape of it. Her father's business, the collapse, the debts, the absence of options that had made the broker's advertisement look like possibility rather than desperation. She told it plainly, without self-pity, the way you state facts that are simply facts, not performances of suffering, but not concealment either. She told it the way her mother had taught her to tell the truth, which was to look at the person you were telling and not look away. "I came here because I had no other choice," she said. "I stayed because I chose to. Those are different things, and I think most of you understand the difference." She let that sit for a moment. "I know what people have been saying," she said. I know where those things have been coming from." She did not look at Mrs. Whitfield when she said this. She did not need to. "I'm asking you to make up your own minds based on what you observe rather than what you've been told. That's all." The room was silent. Then Mrs. Hester Drummond, who was sitting near the window with her hands folded in her lap, stood up. She did not say anything. She simply stood, which in the language of such rooms meant everything it needed to mean. Nora Webb stood next, which was brave in the particular way that young people can be brave when they have decided which side of a thing they are on and are willing to accept the consequences. 2 more women stood. Then a third. Mrs. Whitfield remained seated. She was still seated when Vivienne thanked the room for their time and let herself out. She drove home through the January cold, the horse's breath showing white in the sharp air. The valley spread out around her in the particular beauty of winter, and she did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened until the ranch house came into view on the rise above the creek, and she recognized it as the thing she had been driving toward. Home. The word arrived without announcement. She had not called it that before. She had called it the ranch, the house, this place. But looking at the log and stone structure with the smoke coming from its chimney and the horses moving in the corral and the bare winter garden that would be full of things again by May, she understood that the word had been becoming true for some time, and she had simply not been paying attention to that particular change. Garrett was on the porch when she arrived, which meant he had seen the wagon coming from a distance and had come out to wait. He helped her down without asking where she had been, which meant Nora had told him, or he had figured it out himself. Both were equally possible. He stood beside the wagon and looked at her in the cold afternoon light. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, "I told them the truth." "I know," he said. "Nora came by an hour ago." They stood in the cold together for a moment. "Come inside," he said. "The coffee's hot." That night, long after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch house had gone quiet, Vivienne was in the kitchen banking the fire for the night when she realized the back door had not opened and closed the way it usually did when Garrett went to check on the horses before bed. She went to the window. He was sitting on the porch steps, in the cold, in the dark, his coat on but his hat set beside him on the step, his shoulders curved inward with the posture of a man who is not expecting to be watched and has allowed himself to be something other than composed. She put her shawl on and went out. He did not look up immediately when she came through the door. She sat beside him on the step, closer than she had sat in the autumn because the cold required it, and she felt him register her presence and make no move to straighten or arrange himself back into the usual shape. She waited. "I keep thinking about Margaret," he said at last. His voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. "About the night she died. About the way the doctor looked at me, and I knew before he said anything." He paused. "I've spent 3 years not thinking about it, just not allowing it, working until I was too tired to do anything except sleep." Vivienne sat beside him and said nothing. "I'm terrified," he said, "that I'm going to lose everything again. The ranch. He stopped. He turned his head away from her, and she heard the breath go out of him in the way that breath goes when a man is trying to hold something back that is larger than his ability to hold it. She put her hand on his back, not his shoulder, his back, between his shoulder blades, where the tension was concentrated, and she felt the whole structure of him shudder once under her hand, and then again. And then Garrett Hollowell, who had been holding the weight of 3 years of grief and solitude and enforced composure, stopped holding it. It was not quiet. It was not a single dignified tear. It was the real thing, the kind of grief that has been compressed by time and work and the necessity of keeping a ranch running and 3 men employed and a life in motion, all of that coming out at once in the January dark on the porch steps of the house he had built and was afraid of losing. Vivienne did not speak. She did not offer comfort in words because words were not what was needed. She kept her hand on his back, and she stayed. When it was over, the quiet that followed was different from the quiet before it, cleaner somehow, the particular quality of air after a storm has moved through. Garrett straightened. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. He breathed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't," Vivienne said. He looked at her. "Don't apologize," she said. "Not for that." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and what she saw in his face was what she imagined her own face looked like on the morning she had arrived in Elco, after 19 days of travel and a lifetime of managing alone, when Garrett Hollowell had looked at her fear and called it reasonable and handed her a key with no copy. She understood now why that had mattered so much. She had been offering him the same thing all along without knowing she was doing it. The evidence of who you were, placed without condition in the hands of someone who needed to know they were not alone. They sat on the porch steps in the January cold for a long time, the stars over Nevada doing their indifferent, brilliant work above them, and at some point, Garrett's hand found hers on the step between them and covered it, and neither of them said anything about it, and the night went on around them the way nights do, large and cold, and full of the particular silence of a place where 2 people have finally stopped being strangers to each other. The general store confrontation happened 4 days later. Vivienne had not planned it as a public event. She had gone to town to deliver the lawyer's written assessment to Garrett's banker, and Silas Draymond happened to be there, which she suspected was not entirely coincidental. He was in conversation with 2 other men when she walked in, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided that pleasantness is no longer a useful tool, and has moved on to something more direct. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I hope you've spoken some sense into your husband." "I've spoken the truth into my lawyer," Vivienne said. She laid the assessment on the banker's counter. She explained it clearly, the clause, the illegal transfer, the enforceability question. She spoke in the measured, organized voice of someone who is prepared carefully and is presenting facts rather than making arguments. She did not look at Draymond while she spoke. She looked at the banker, who read the document with increasing attention, and then looked at Draymond with a different quality of expression than he had been wearing a moment before. The store was not empty. It was never empty at this hour. And by the time Vivienne had finished speaking, there were 7 people in the room, all of whom had heard every word. Draymond's pleasantness was entirely gone. In its place was something that was not quite anger, but was the close relative of it, the expression of a man who has made his calculations and found them suddenly wrong. "This isn't over," he said. "That's your decision," Vivienne said. She heard the store door open behind her. Garrett stepped in. He crossed the room and came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Draymond, but exactly beside her, their shoulders level, his presence added to hers without replacing it. He did not say anything. He looked at Draymond with the straightforward, unimpressed expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and is no longer required to be. Draymond looked at the two of them standing together in the general store of Elco, Nevada, in January of 1879. Then he picked up his hat from the counter and walked out. The store was very quiet. Then someone began to speak again, and someone else answered, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon reassembled themselves around what had just happened, and Vivienne felt Garrett's hand come to rest briefly at the small of her back, there and then gone. The briefest possible acknowledgement of what they had just done and what it meant. She straightened her coat. She thanked the banker for his time. She walked out into the January afternoon beside Garrett Hollowell. And if the word that came to mind was not yet official, it was already true in every way that mattered, into the cold, bright air of a Nevada winter. And she thought that she had come here terrified, and had found, somewhere between the terror and this moment, that the ground beneath her feet was solid after all. It had taken 4 months to discover that. She suspected it would take a lifetime to understand everything it meant. They were married on a Saturday at the end of January in the small church at the edge of Elco where Reverend Thomas had been conducting services for 11 years and had learned to read the difference between a ceremony that was a formality and one that was something else entirely. This was something else entirely. Vivienne wore her blue silk dress, the one that had survived her father's collapse because it had been at the dressmaker's for alterations when the creditors came, and so had escaped the inventory of loss. She had not worn it since Boston. Putting it on that morning in the small bedroom of the ranch house, she had stood before the mirror for a long moment, looking at the woman in it, and had found that she did not recognize her the way she had expected to. The dress was the same. The woman was not. She had arrived in Nevada in September terrified of everything ahead of her. It was now January, and she was terrified of almost nothing. Garrett was waiting at the front of the church when she came down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Beckett, who had offered with the gruff practicality of a man who understood that some gestures mattered more than the words around them. Garrett wore the suit that sat slightly formally on his rancher's frame, his hair combed, his face freshly shaved, and when he turned and saw her, his expression did something that she had no precise word for, something that moved through his features like light moving through water, present and then settled, but leaving everything it touched slightly changed. He took her hand when she reached him. His hand was warm and steady and rough with the work of his life, and she felt the steadiness of it move up through her arm and into her chest, and she thought that this was what people meant when they spoke about feeling anchored, not held down, anchored. The difference between those two things was everything. Reverend Thomas conducted the ceremony with the quiet attention of a man who took the words seriously. When it came time for the vows, Garrett spoke his in the measured, careful voice that she had come to understand was not the voice of a man who felt little, but the voice of a man who felt a great deal and had learned to carry it without spilling it. He said the traditional words, and then he paused, and what came next was not in any ceremony she had ever witnessed. "I promise to earn your trust," he said, "every day, for as long as we live." The church was very quiet. Vivienne's throat tightened. She thought about the boarding house room in September, the key on the bedside table, the letter at the bottom of the bag. She thought about what it had meant to hear those words the first time, from a stranger in a general store who had no reason yet to mean them. She thought about everything that had happened since. "I know you will," she said, which was not in any ceremony either, and Reverend Thomas smiled and continued, "And when he pronounced them married, Garrett touched his lips to her cheek with the particular gentleness of a man who is still being careful, still giving her the room she had needed and did not need any more. She turned her face and kissed him properly. Something shifted in the church, not sound exactly, but the quality of the air, the kind of collective exhale that happens when a room full of people have been holding something on behalf of two people who have finally stopped needing them to hold it. Mrs. Drummond had organized the wedding supper at the boarding house with the efficiency of a woman who expressed love through logistics, and the table was full of food, and the room was full of people who had known Garrett for years and had known Vivienne for 4 months, and had decided collectively and without much discussion that they were glad of what had happened. Dr. Beckett made a toast that was mostly practical and entirely sincere. Nora Webb cried, which she would have denied if asked. Vivienne sat beside her husband at the long table and looked at the faces around her. These people who had not known her 4 months ago and now knew her as one of their own and felt the specific texture of belonging, which was different from the belonging she had grown up with in Boston, less assumed and therefore more real. Something she had been present for the building of rather than simply inherited. Mrs. Drummond pressed her hand at the end of the evening. "You'll do fine," the older woman said. "More than fine." "I already have," Vivienne said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Vivienne sat beside her husband in the warm noise of it and felt something she had been afraid to name for several months now settle into its permanent shape. She was happy. Not the cautious, provisional happiness of someone waiting for the other shoe. Simply happy. The way a room is warm, as a condition rather than a contrast. Spring came to the valley in March, and with it the resolution of the thing that had been hanging over them since December. The lawyer's assessment of the illegal note transfer had done its work quietly through February. Horace Finch corresponding with the original bank and with Draymond's representatives in the measured, inexorable way of legal proceedings that have a clear answer on their side. Draymond had no appetite for a public fight over a clause he had overlooked, and the matter resolved itself without a courtroom. The note returned to the original bank and refinanced on terms that were manageable. The crisis reduced by Vivienne's careful reading to a problem with a solution. Garrett told her the final outcome on a March evening on the porch. The air still cold, but carrying the first suggestion of the warmth that was coming. And she received the information with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done careful work and seen it hold. "Draymond won't trouble us again," Garrett said. "No," Vivienne agreed, "because of what you found in the ledger books, because of what you found in the note." She looked at him. "We held the ranch," she said. "That's what matters." He looked back at her with the expression that she had learned was his version of saying things he did not have words for. Everything in the quality of the attention, the directness of it, the way it did not waver. "Yes," he said, "that's what matters." She discovered she was pregnant in April. She knew before she was certain, the way the body sometimes announces things before the mind is ready to receive them. And she sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told Garrett, not from fear of his reaction, but from the particular private quality of the first days of knowing something enormous, the desire to hold it alone for a little while before it belonged to both of them. When she told him, he was at the kitchen table with the morning's coffee, and she sat across from him and said it plainly the way she said most things, and she watched his face move through something that she had never seen on it before. A pure, uncomplicated joy, arriving without qualification or caveat. The face of a man who had not allowed himself to expect this and was now being given it anyway. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not speak for a moment. "Are you frightened?" he finally asked. She thought of Margaret. She knew he was thinking of Margaret. The knowledge sat between them, acknowledged without being spoken, the way the most important things sometimes lived between people who had learned to trust the space between words. "A little," she said honestly, "and also very glad." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there. "Dr. Beckett will see you every month," he said, "and when the time comes, we'll make sure you have everything you need." "I know," she said. "I won't lose you," he said, very quietly, the sentence carrying the weight of the thing he was not saying, the fear underneath it, the specific shape of a loss he knew and could not unfeel. "I can't." "You won't," she said. She said it with the same quality of certainty she had used in the winter when she said they would make the numbers work, not the certainty of someone who knows the future, but the certainty of someone who has decided to move toward it without flinching. "I'm still here. I intend to keep being here." The summer was warm and slow and full of the particular quality of a life that has found its rhythm. Vivienne's garden came in abundantly, the plants she had rescued from neglect in October producing through the summer with the enthusiasm of things that have been given a second chance and intend to use it. She preserved and dried and organized, and the ranch house, which had been a structure when she arrived, had become entirely a home. Every room settled into itself, every corner considered. The writing lessons had long since become simply writing, the two of them going out in the evenings when the day's work was done, Vivienne on Clover, who had become genuinely fond of her in the way that patient animals become fond of patient people. They rode without destination sometimes, simply out into the valley and back, talking or not talking in the comfortable alternation of people who have run out of the need to fill silence. On some of these evenings, Garrett talked about the future, not in the cautious way he had talked about it in the early months, measuring his words against the possibility of disappointment, but openly, the way a man talks when he has decided that hope is worth the risk. He spoke about expanding the herd, about improving the breeding stock, about the possibility of adding a second water source in the south pasture. He spoke about Benjamin Aldrich, the neighboring rancher whose daughter had just started the school in Elco, and how he thought the school would grow. He spoke about what it might mean to Thomas, the son he was already certain they were having, to grow up knowing this land from the beginning, to understand what it meant to build something from nothing. Vivienne listened to these conversations with a particular pleasure that she recognized after a while as the pleasure of being included, not consulted as a formality, not informed after decisions had been made, but genuinely included, her opinions solicited and her thoughts received as contributions worth considering. She had not known, growing up in Boston, that this was something a marriage could contain. Her mother had died too early for her to learn it from observation, and her father had been a man of his era, certain that his decisions were his alone to make. What she had found instead, in this rough frontier house with its cedar box memories and its kitchen garden and its view of mountains she had never imagined loving, was a man who spoke to her as though her understanding of the world was as valid as his own. She thought this might be the most unexpected gift she had ever received. One evening in late July, when the heat had finally broken and the air carried the smell of the sage that Vivienne had come to love with the particular intensity of something adopted rather than inherited, they rode up to the high point above the ranch where the full valley was visible below. They dismounted and stood together looking at it, the creek catching the last of the sun, the cattle like dark commas scattered across the grass, the ranch house on its rise with the smoke from the evening fire just beginning. "I want to show you something," Garrett said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a key. It was larger than the key he had given her in September, heavier, with the particular worn smoothness of something used daily for years. The key to the main gate of Hollowell Ranch, the lock at the entrance of the property where the road from Elco came through. "This is the ranch," he said. "All of it. Not the part I'm letting you live in, not the part I'm sharing with you." He held it out. "This is yours, the same as it's mine." Vivienne took the key. She held it in her palm beside the swell of the child she was carrying, and she thought about September, about the first key, the room key with no copy, and what it had meant to receive it from a stranger who had understood that she needed to be given back the smallest possible piece of control over her own existence. This was not a small thing. This was everything. She reached into the pocket of her riding coat. She had been carrying the letter for days now, waiting for the right moment, understanding that the right moment would make itself known, and not forcing it. She brought it out and held it for a moment, the familiar folded paper, soft at the creases from years of handling, and then she tore it in half. Then she tore it again. She let the pieces go in the evening breeze off the valley, and they scattered and were gone. 4 sentences from a man who had not been worth the paper he wrote them on, released into the Nevada air without ceremony or grief, simply finished. Garrett watched without asking. He did not need to ask. She looked at him in the evening light, this man she had come to in terror and had found, over the months of their shared life, to be exactly what he had presented himself as from the first afternoon in the general store. Consistent, careful, capable of a depth of feeling that he offered quietly, without performance, the way he offered everything, as a thing that was simply true, and therefore did not require demonstration. "I want to show you something too," she said. She went back to the saddlebag on Clover and brought out a flat package wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to him. He unwrapped it carefully, with the deliberate attention he brought to anything he was being given, and inside was Margaret's faded blue apron, the one that had hung on the kitchen nail for 3 years, untouched, now folded with precision and smoothed flat as though it had been tended to rather than merely stored, and resting on top of it, a small card in Vivienne's handwriting. He read it. She had written, "Margaret loved you first. I will love you longest." There is room enough for both of those things to be true. Garrett stood on the hillside above the valley he had built his life on and looked at what his wife had written, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been seen completely and has found it bearable, more than bearable, necessary, the thing that makes a life feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. He folded the card carefully and put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, which she thought was not an accident. He held out his hand. She took it. They stood together on the high ground above Hollowell Ranch in the July evening, the valley spreading below them in the last of the light, and the child between them, not yet in the world, but already present in every decision they made, and every morning they woke to, and every evening they sat on the porch and watched the Nevada sky perform its nightly extravagance. Their son was born in September. A warm afternoon, the first anniversary of the day, Vivienne had stepped off the stagecoach in Elco with a carpet bag and a letter, and a terror so complete it had occupied her entire chest. Dr. Beckett arrived in time, and Mrs. Drummond came with him. And Garrett stayed beside Vivienne through all of it, his face white and his hands steady, whispering things she would not remember afterward, but felt as a continuous warmth against her ear. The labor was long and difficult, and there were hours in the middle of it when the doctor's expression reminded Garrett of something he could not afford to think about. And during those hours, he held Vivienne's hand and talked to her in the same low, continuous voice she had learned from watching him with his horses. Not quite words, just presence, just the sound of a man who was not going anywhere. She heard him, through the pain and the fear and the specific exhaustion of a body working harder than it had ever worked. She heard him, and it steadied her the way the sound of the creek steadied her when she could not sleep. The way the smell of the coffee in the morning steadied her. The way the sight of the ranch house on its rise steadied her when she came home through the cold. She was not alone. She had not been alone for a long time. When it was over, when the child's voice announced itself to the ranch house and to the valley beyond, Garrett pressed his forehead gently against Vivienne's and stayed there, breathing, his eyes closed. And she understood that he was doing two things simultaneously, welcoming what had arrived and releasing what he had feared, the grief of one moment and the joy of another occupying the same breath, the same man, the same pair of hands holding hers. She understood this because she was doing it too. "He's here," she said. "He's here," Garrett said. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular and everyone in general, the name simply arriving as the right one in the way that some things arrive, without explanation, complete. The evening of that same day, after Dr. Beckett had gone, and Mrs. Drummond had made sure everything was in order and quietly let herself out, Garrett sat beside the bed with the child in his arms, in the particular careful way of a man holding something he cannot believe he has been trusted with. And Vivienne watched him from the pillow and thought about September, about the stagecoach and the dust and the first sight of Elco through the window glass, the fear that had been so large it left no room for anything else, about the key on the bedside table, about a man carrying her bag as though it were not a burden, about a man saying he was not looking for a prisoner, about the long, slow accumulation of ordinary days that had built, without her quite noticing the construction, into a life she would not trade for the one she had lost. She thought about all of the choices she had made since September, the daily small ones and the large ones, and the ones she had not recognized as choices at all until she looked back on them from this vantage point. And she understood that this was what the broker's advertisement had not been able to promise her, and what Garrett himself had not been able to guarantee. Not safety, not security, not respectability, but the possibility of a life worth choosing. She had found it. Day by careful day, she had built it. And it was hers. She reached out and touched the baby's hand, which closed around her finger with the blind certainty of new things that do not yet know what uncertainty is. 1 year ago today, she said softly. Garrett looked up at her. "I stepped off a stagecoach," she said, "and I was so frightened I could barely breathe." "I know," he said. "I saw. And you handed me a key. It seemed like the right thing to do. She looked at him across the child they had made together, in the ranch house that had become her home, in the valley that had become her landscape, in the life that had become, improbably and entirely, hers. It was, she said. It was exactly the right thing. Outside, the Nevada sky was doing what it always did at the end of a September day, setting itself on fire in colors that had no business being so excessive, orange and rose, and something close to gold. The whole western horizon lit as though the land itself was celebrating something. Vivienne Ashcroft Hollowell, who had arrived in this place with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter and a terror she had carried alone for 19 days, looked out the window at the burning sky and felt the fear, the last small remainder of it, finally and completely let her go. She did not watch it leave. She was looking at her husband and her son and the life she had chosen, day by ordinary day, into existence. That was enough. That was everything